Now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, thank you for your patience. Welcome to the ESIT webinar, Utilising POCT and Service Redesign to Establish an AEC Service, presented by Dr. Dominic Giles, Acute Medicine Registrar from James Paget University Hospitals NHS Foundation Trust. Before we begin, I just have a few simple housekeeping points. This session is being recorded and the recording will be available to view on the website shortly. All attendees are muted to avoid background noise during the recording. At the end of the presentation, there will be the opportunity to ask questions. If you have a question, please use the raise your hand option in the panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Alternatively, you can write your question in the question section on the panel. During the Q&A sections, we will unmute you to ask your question in person. Thank you, and I'll now hand you over to Dominic. Thank you, Dominic.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. As has been amplified, I'm Dominic. I'm one of the acute medicine registrars for James Paget Hospital. And I've been very aptly tasked with talking to you about our novel ambulatory emergency care service that we've established over the past 18 months here, which utilises not only point of care blood testing, but also a service redesign process to create what we think is not only a relatively unique service, but also one that seems to be generating very, very good numbers and very positive outcomes for our patients. So just to give a little bit of a background to start with, the James Paget Hospital opened in 1982. It's actually a relatively small district general hospital with a catchment area of about 240,000 patients. We believe we're possibly the most eastern NHS Acute Medicine Trust or Acute Trust, certainly in England and possibly in the UK. We have a relatively sort of modest operating budget of 160 million a year, but as I'm sure everyone's aware, that's obviously facing increasing pressures year on year due to changes in funding, both centrally and locally, with negotiations ongoing at varying points. So to give a little bit of background about why we opted to set up our own AEC service, ambulatory care, and sort of the thought process behind it, I'm sure many of you will be aware of the sort of more recent Safer, Faster, Better report that came out that highly recommends AEC to be a pivotal part of any acute medicine service, but actually a pivotal part of actually most acute trusts. In decreasing not only hospital length of stay, but actually also supporting improved revenue for the trust with savings. The King's Fund in 2013, I believe, published a report that did sort of state that conventionally these patients who were acute medicine patients, normally admitting overnight but could potentially be managed through an AE service, would cost the NHS about 1.24 billion a year. And if you just decrease their length of stay down, you could save approximately 683 million. Those are obviously nationwide figures, but even extrapolating that out to a local perspective, that's quite significant savings for individual trusts. The whole ethos of ambulatory care or emergency ambulatory care is to focus on 0-day length of stays. And I'm very, very clear on that particular terminology. We're not trying to avoid admissions for these patients. These are patients who need to come into hospital. They need to be seen by an acute physician, and they need specialist input, intervention, investigations, and a specialist treatment plan. However, that plan does not necessarily require them spending an overnight stay in hospital. It might require them to, say, attend on 2 or more occasions for investigations and for follow-up, but they don't need to be in a bed overnight, not really having anything done. And actually, from a personal perspective, talking to patients and from some of our feedback, certainly nationally feedback that I've picked up as well, a lot of patients are actually going very beneficial of that service. And if you suggest to a patient, we will do everything for you exactly the same way, but you can go home and sleep in your own bed, eat your own dinner tonight, they will usually bite your arm off for it. The final point I just want to bring up at this point is about laboratory testing, because as these patients require a in-depth, broad investigation panel, that ultimately will boil down to the laboratory, and we particularly focus on looking at that as a point, and I'll move on to it in a minute. But a very, very interesting statistic that we found is that laboratory testing accounts for approximately 4% of healthcare budget, but actually will influence 66% of the healthcare costs, and that's in discharge times, length of stays, drug choices, investigation choices, and management roles. So it's actually quite a relatively small budget for a very, very large impact. With all of this in mind, here at the James Paget Hospital, we sat down and decided that we had no real AEC service, and we needed an AEC service. We looked at several models, and there are options out there looking at process or push or pull models or pathway designed models. And we were very fortunate. We had some very interesting conversations with industry partners at POCT, and then a company called Operacy who specialise in healthcare service design. And we had these very interesting conversations with these people, and we elected to go for a process-driven approach. And we decided that in order to do this, we would do it properly. So we took a very broad, multidisciplinary approach. We have a very, very engaged executive sponsor, our Director of Operations. But we also have a team that encompasses not only acute medicine consultants, not only myself as an acute medicine registrar. We have our POCT lead for the trust, who actually is now our project manager. He was supposed to be helping me give this talk, but he's off doing it somewhere else in another part of the world. So you got me, unfortunately. But we also have used our nursing colleagues, our Band 5 nurses, our Band 6, our Band 7 nurses, and also our Band 3 and 4 support workers who now play an integral part into our process. And we used a very industrialized type process to look at the process through a department for a patient. So we did a full mapping of a patient's journey, so a full process activity map, where we quite literally followed 2 or 3 patients from their point of entry into the hospital to their point of leaving acute medicine services, and mapped every single step in that, down to times that it took for a doctor to see them, times it took for a nurse to see them, consultant review times, times between investigation requesting, times between blood tests being requested, being processed, and being looked at. And we broke all of that down into very, very individualized blocks. From that, we were able to come up with the trial model that you can see on the right of the screen there, which is a very much a simplified version of the process that we use, but still rings very true, which is that our GP and our A&E referrals come into a single point of access. They are then investigated, reviewed, consultant reviewed at the very early stage, and then ideally discharged home or brought back for follow-up. As you can see in that process, we've always left the get-out clause at any point, which is that any of our patients can be converted to an emergency admission via our acute medical unit, which we call the ADU here. As part of this planning and process phase, we realised that point-of-care blood testing could be a very critical enabler for the whole process. We noted that it took approximately 90 minutes from bloods being taken to blood results being appreciably acknowledged by a doctor. And that's a variety of different delays. That was through the delay in bloods being taken down to the lab, either through the pneumatic tube system not working, someone walking them down, through delays in lab, both processing and time on the analyzers, batching and things like that. But also actually through time that the blood results were delivered onto our electronic blood results system, but not actually looked at. If the clinicians do not know they're there, then they can't act on these bloods. And as I'm sure many of you will be aware, unfortunately the clinicians can't sit in front of the computer all day waiting for a blood test to come back. and certainly we don't have or didn't have a system that will automatically notify us personally when our blood results come back. As such, we used POCT to remove some of those steps, and I'll come on to that in a little bit of time regarding actually some of the sort of the steps and the value added time that we looked at. We also looked very closely at process ownership without the whole model. It's documented that if you've got ownership of your own process, you're more likely to engage in it better. So we have a number of process owners within the ambulatory unit who are very keen, motivated as part of the process, and they've been used for the past year to help push along the changes and implement them well. And that's a great benefit to everybody, because we now have a very well-oiled team that's very closely knit and are all very, very keen to make the project succeed. And by making the project succeed, we are making better gains for our patients. So a little bit more about our systematic approach to the actual project design. I said we went through and process activity mapped all of our patients. Well, as part of that, in order for that to work, we had to define what our value was for our patients. And these are slightly more engineering style of process design, but something that you can and we have translated into medical services, particularly in acute medicine. So for our patients, we defined value as the length of stay the patient was there, be that days, minutes, hours, hopefully not months, but in some unfortunate circumstances it is. By defining value, you can look at what steps in that process that we mapped actually add value. And you can broadly categorize that down into 3 steps, and that's value adding, non-value adding but essential, and non-value adding. And from our mapping and from other colleagues, we've noticed approximately 85% of an emergency patient's inpatient time is spent waiting and is actually a non-value adding step. So we had an 85% of the time a patient was in hospital to play with, to cut out, and to actually redesign a process to make that work. And as I've alluded to, there are several steps in that process which are non-value adding. I've mentioned pathology as a time for blood results being approximately 90 minutes in our trust. Diagnostic imaging is another one, be that X-ray, more complex radiology, or ultrasound, bedside ultrasound. And then there is the actual discharge side of things, so the discharge letter being written, the drugs being dispensed to take home, and potentially transport services to get them home. And what we've done is redesigned the work process to eliminate each one of these steps in turn, or as eliminate as best as we can each step in turn, to expedite the patient's journey without compromising it. So now our patients come in, they are assessed by a band 3 or 4, they're a clinical support assistant for us, who will do their blood tests for us. They will do an ECG and they will do observations. They will do blood tests compared to a panel of predefined condition-specific algorithms, which I will show you in a couple of slides' time. We use POCT blood testing for that reason. And again, I'll just expand on that shortly. But once we then have a well-set, effectively dossier for the patients that can be handed to a senior clinical decision maker, who at that point will be able to make an informed plan for patients, will be able to give a clear next step as to what that is going to be. And that may be further investigations, it may be discharge home. But there is lots of evidence out there, and I'm sure you're all aware of it, that actually if you give the earlier a patient sees a consultant or a senior clinical decision maker, that the the patient's length of stay is drastically reduced. And if you give that senior clinical decision maker as much information as they can at the point where they see the patient, that's going to only expedite that process. So it does boil down to the very sort of neat phrase: right patient, right place, right result, right clinician, and right time. However, that is only part of the whole process that we were utilising. We've also moved to make our own performance visible. So every day at the end of the day, on the on the door of our ambulatory office, we have a little graph and a little whiteboard with a grid on it, which simply says how many patients we've seen that day, how many we've discharged that day, how many we've admitted that day, and in the earlier days, how many were unable to attend ambulatory. And those simple things have greatly improved the flow through the units. We now have more external staff coming to us asking how ambulatory is doing, and they can see it with their own eyes and can be impressed by it. Our own staff are trying to not compete against themselves, but are always aware of how we're doing, and we are aware when we have a slow day. We look at why we're having a slow day. And equally, other members of the trust, so the operational side of things, the bed management, the patient flow side of the trust, are always aware of how many patients we've seen and direct impact that ambulatory as a small unit is having on the trust as a whole. That's not to say it's not always been absolutely perfect. We've had problems, as any new service in any trust will have, but certainly visual performance has greatly improved and helped with our mitigation of those problems. So I hope I've sort of explained a little bit of how we've redesigned our whole work process throughout the ambulatory and tried to build a structure to the patient flow requiring what the patient needs rather than what the clinician or trust or department or senior management or anyone else seems to think the patient might need. And I've just sort of started to highlight some of the scientific side of things that we've done. We've come at this perhaps from a different angle. We started with a patient and we've then moved from there, as opposed to starting with the current system and try and redesign that. The final point on that slide is one that sometimes gives me nightmares still: the failure mode and effect analysis. This is our governance tool for the whole unit. It is, again, it is borrowed from engineering and from industry, but it is exactly what it says on the tin. We have taken a process, we've built a process, and we've designed it, and we have it all down on paper. That initial flowchart that I showed you a little while ago. From that flowchart, we have gone down and tried to break that process. We all sat in a big meeting for about 8 hours and went through each individual problem we could come up with, work out why that problem might occur, and then looked at ways we could mitigate that problem, we could prevent it, or we could reduce the risk. And we also looked at the likelihood of that problem occurring, and also the chance of that problem being detected. So a brief sort of example of that I can use for everybody is blood testing. Everyone's aware of blood tests, and a catastrophic answer would be the wrong patient's blood results being looked at when compared against a different patient. So that could be that we've got the wrong patient's name on a blood result sample. There's lots of different causes for that, and the most obvious one for that would be the blood not being labelled by the patient's bedside with the wrong name on it, and that wrong identification being carried through the process. So how can we mitigate? Well, what's the chance of that being detected? Well, the chances of that being detected are actually a bit 50-50, because if the blood test is completely normal, you wouldn't necessarily look at it if you've got a patient you're not expecting an abnormal blood test on. So actually that's a relatively decent risk. The chances of it causing harm, well, again, that could be quite significant harm. If you're looking at a simple blood test that was normal when it was actually supposed to be abnormal, you could have significant harm from that. And the chances, and how do we mediate that process? Well, obviously we train everybody to label their blood tests at the bedside. to have 2 points of ID or 3 points of ID even, sorry, and to be constantly vigilant, and also to check the blood results are corresponding to what we would expect with the patient and the clinician. I don't think that little explanation does the FMEA or failure mode effect analysis any justice at all, but it's a document that provides an overall governance structure, and actually when we did it, we, as I said, had 6 hours in a room or 8 hours in a room with a lot of coffee, and we were all a little bit exhausted afterwards. But we have since come out, and it's become one of the most, if not the most valuable documents we have produced as part of the process. Because every problem that has occurred has already been thought of on the FMEA, or at least a small variation of it. When we've encountered any unexpected problems, we moved location, for example, there was some building work involved, we put that through an FMEA process, and we were then able to mitigate potential problems that occurred at that point. And it's probably one of the things that I would suggest to anybody undertaking project or process redesign to have a very strong thought behind using it. It is not easy, but it is invaluable at that point, and I would now do it for any service that we redesign as part of that. So as we moved on from sort of the planning phase into the actual sort of project itself, we developed a full project plan. You can see that shrunk down quite significantly there, but that covered, I think, 4 months in timescale. Maybe that's just a small part of it actually on that picture. And the idea of this is, again, we have a very clear plan of what's going to happen. There are little crosses in the box for when this should happen, in a date that we should expect it to happen. You update it every day, and if you've done the job on that day, the box gets highlighted green. If you haven't done the box on that day, the box gets highlighted red, and you put a red cross in the following day's box to indicate to yourself and anyone else involved in the project that you have missed something. Now that can be for expected delays or unexpected delays, but it still gives you a very clear look through the whole process. And I think as a whole we're quite proud that there's only a little tiny bit of red on that for a couple of things, which I think looking at it in the end weren't really needed quite so importantly. The final quote at the bottom is from Safer, Faster, Better report, which I think is very, very relevant for the whole of this AEC process, but actually moves on to the fact that we have to incorporate this into the rest of the trust as well. And the critical mass is only developed and good practice implemented systematically, without unwarranted variation along the entire pathway. And that's exactly what I've been trying to explain for the past few minutes, with a very clear stratified project plan, a very clear stratified governance process through the FMEA, and a very clear process for the actual department to run through as well. Sort of moving on a little bit more into how we actually work on a daily basis per se. As I said earlier, our patients arrive and they're met by one of our CSAs, sorry, who will either band 3 or band 4, and does our basic observations, ECG, and then blood tests and investigations related to our ambulatory unit investigation panel, which is, again, condition specific. So we've gone through the regular AEC tariff conditions, but also the patients that we were seeing regularly as part of our project mapping and demand mapping coming through, or we expected to come through our AEC services. And we've then looked through all of their regular investigations, sat down with national and local guidelines as to what investigations they need to have done, what investigations we are likely to want from them, or what investigations we always did from them regardless of what they came in with. And we've then come up with that little investigation panel at the bottom left, which I appreciate doesn't project particularly well. But what you can see is there are 3 columns on there with just about every patient gets from. That is what we call our Chem 8, which is our POCT chemistry panel, so it's effectively a use-and-ease, our full blood count panel, and also an ECG. And it is a very small cluster of tests that we use, and that's very, very deliberate. We've got them listed at the top there. We have a 4 blood count analyzer, a D-dimer, a chemistry panel, i.e. the Chem8, a blood gas, the CG4, and also a PTI in our cartridge. And actually, with that level of investigation panel, it's a very focused panel, but gives us, as acute physicians, the information that we feel we need to make decisions. There are some extra tests, and I'm sure if you're keen-eyed and can flick through it, you will see the extra tests that are requested in there at times. But again, we have spoken to our laboratory, and they give us as good a priority as they give our A&E services. So we expect most of our tests back within an hour. The POCT use is controlled because it's new technology, and everyone loves a bit of new technology, wants to get in and play with it. So there are only 5 or 6 people on the shop floor who actually have a barcode to use the POCT usage. My consultant pictured in the picture there, the lead for ambulatory unit, doesn't actually know how to use any of the stuff. And as part of that, we've continually monitored it. And actually, that investigation panel is going to be redesigned in the next couple of months because we have now stopped using our PTI and our cartridges. We weren't using enough of them. We felt we didn't need them. And our lab turnaround times were actually more appropriate. So we'll be taking that out. In terms of other investigations, we have access to plain radiographs. Again, we've spoken and discussed quite well with our radiology department, who do us a great service by fitting our patients in with the same times as they would for an A&E patient, so they give them urgent priority. Our most common non-plain radiograph investigation would be a CT pulmonary angiogram, CTPA. And again, while we were not able to get dedicated daily slots because we didn't feel we needed them, we negotiated very well with our radiology departments, who have agreed that they will slot our patients in between their patients. As our patients are ambulant and walk around there, we will speak to our patient, we will speak to radiology, we will say, we've got up CTPA, is there any chance you can do it this afternoon? They will say, normally, yes, send them around, they'll wait in our waiting room for a little while, but we'll squeeze them in as the next patient can leave the scanner while waiting for the porter to bring the next one in. So again, we're just cutting down those little bits of non-value adding time in the whole journey to try and speed up the patient's experience, but without actually causing any adverse effects to the actual patient's pathway investigations and treatments. So the bit that sort of the headline figures, moving on a little bit now, are our data, our pilot data. We went live in August 2014 for an initial 3-month trial. As you can see, it was initially relatively small numbers, but gradually increased up to about 9 patients a day. Our length of stays, you will appreciate there, is measured in minutes, not hours. And that was, again, sitting around the 150-minute mark, although the median was significantly lower due to some other issues. And we were discharging approximately 80 to 90% of patients a day. To put that into context, the Safer, Faster, Better report, which I keep referring back to, doesn't really give any clear key performance indicators for acute medicine services as a whole, but it suggests that you should look to use the same KPIs as an A&E department. So that would mean a 4-hour length of stay for our patients, which we were comfortably achieving here. What the little points at the bottom show is that our length of stay on our AMU decreased down to its lowest ever level during this trial period of 0.8 bed days, while AMU was only seeing 26% of the acute medicine referrals. So for seeing a quarter of our acute medicine referrals, we knocked quite a significant amount of our length of stay, which shows you the impact that our AEC service was having on our overall acute medicine service. Our mean length of stay reduction was over 40%, from a 250-minute baseline for these patients who were being seen already but without a really stratified process, down to, as I say, 140 40 to 180 or 100 to 180 minutes. And as part of this, we had a subsequent 8.2% increase in zero-day admissions throughout the trust, which beautifully corresponded to an 8.93% reduction in our 1, 2 and 3 day length of stay admissions, showing that we were achieving pretty much exactly what we set out to achieve. Due to the success of the pilots, we moved on to generate a full business case for a full expansion of services. And we started to hit some problems. As I said, it's not all been plain sailing. There is very little data published regarding the cost effectiveness of POCT. There is some data published around its operational benefits, and there's some around its sort of use and benefit to clinicians, but very, very little that we could find regarding its actual cost effectiveness. And actually that's even more relevant to ourselves here, because our pathology contract is a centralised contract with a static yearly fee, so we're not paying per test. Correspondingly, you can argue that a standard U&E for our lab is about 70p, I believe, and our POCT test is about £4. So we had to start to think a little bit laterally. We had to start to sort of come up with a different way of modelling this. There is obviously a significant reduction in tariff for these patients if you are taking them from a 1, 2 or 3 day length of stay down to a 0 day length of stay. And while the best practice tariffs are very, very useful at this point, they didn't cut all of the financial modelling that we needed. So we had to move into operational modelling, i.e. we were seeing 25 patients a day through our emergency admissions take, and then further 4 patients returning through the AEC network. And if you can follow that flow chart through, which I never can unless I'm sat next to the gentleman that wrote it, you will start to realise that we predicted through 7-day extended opening hours, we would save approximately 15.87 beds per day throughout the trust, which has meant that we have reduced number of cancelled elective operations, reduced number of outlying patients, reduced number of escalation beds being opened. And I'm sure you can start to see how the financial and operational modelling at that point suddenly becomes incredibly complex. And I think we still haven't quite fully explored it all. We've spoken briefly to Imperial College London, who were looking at doing some research work with us about it. That's unfortunately fallen by the wayside, but when we were having conversations with them, they were a bit overawed by the complexities of the operational monitoring we were looking at implementing in order to justify this service. However, when we finally got through it all, you can see on the right side of that little diagram some very base cost calculations, which meant that cost benefit to the trust was about 1.1 million, give or take, which to the CCG itself was just over £500,000, which was obviously quite a significant amount of funding and something that allowed us to finally push the business case through. So to move on to our current state as we speak at the moment, these are our most up-to-date metrics for the end of last year and beginning of January 2016. We moved to a new build environment in May 2016 and saw a significant spike in our numbers at that point because of a change in conditions and state and environment that we were able to see patients in. We've also had an overall 56% reduction in our length of stay, and we have now proven beyond all measurable doubt that we have no increase in demand generation for acute services to the trust. The trust has a gradual, it's about 7% year-on-year increase in acute medicine admissions, which is seen almost nationally. But ambulatory is not seeing any more increase in these patients. So we are quite clearly showing that our service is seeing and discharging these patients who are already in the system and who are now potentially getting a better level of service. Certainly that's my opinion, I'm acute medicine registrar, but are getting it quicker and are getting the full level of intervention they require. And most importantly down there, our patient satisfaction surveys have been almost universally strongly recommended or recommended. In fact, I think the best one that I quote, or we quote quite a lot, is we've had one negative survey through the sort of the mid quartile of, or the third quartile of 2015, and that was that the patient felt he could have been seen a bit quicker. When we looked back at the case, he'd been in hospital. He'd been with us for 2 hours 46 minutes, I think. In that time, he'd had a full set of laboratory investigations. He'd had a chest X-ray. He'd had 2 ECGs. He'd had a CT pulmonary angiogram. He'd been started on appropriate anticoagulation therapy. He'd also had a bedside echocardiogram and was discharged with a further echocardiogram booked in several months' time. So we aren't too worried by some of these complaints, but I think it shows what we can get done if we utilise the service appropriately. You'll see very quickly January has a bit of a spike of numbers. Looking back, we're just starting to analyse that data, but we think it's a combination of Christmas seeing slightly more worried well. There's also a lot more viral flu around that we are taking a lot more of. And also we have just finished our in-depth discussions with our community services. So we now are taking referrals directly from our paramedic teams. The Trust Halo is regularly bringing patients around to us. We've also been out to present to the CCGs and also our out-of-hours GP services to engage them in the process and engage them to speak to us as acute physicians at an earlier stage so we can liaise with these patients. And most importantly, our readmission rates are static. In fact, they are less than the Trust average. So just to graph that performance for you there, as you can see, our overall, the green line at the top, our overall EAGU and acute medicine admissions has been fairly static throughout. The red line is the 1, 2 and 3 day length of stage, and you'll notice a nice little drop just as you hit July or June, July 2014, which was when it opened, and then you'll see another little drop sort of throughout 2015 as we were consolidating our service. The 0 day length of stays is a lovely sharp peak through October 2014, which is when the ambulatory unit pilot finished. If you remember back to the initial figures, we had a good month in October. We got a good spike of patients, and we've then had a gradual increase up there. And we've now seen the lines crossed, which is exactly what we wanted to do, and we believe they're on track to continue to stay crossed. The additional impact, this is obviously to mid-2016 in this graph, but we've shown an 11.4% reduction in movement of patients from our acute medicine hospital into the rest of the hospital. So we are decreasing the number of patients that are actually leaving the acute medicine service into the rest of the trust, allowing more focused patients to move to the right areas. We've massively reduced our medical outliers throughout the trust, and we've got an enhanced elective capacity. In fact, our Director of Operations loves quoting the fact that during 2015, certainly up until November, she never had to cancel a single elective operation for any reason other than ITU or HTU bed capacity. And she certainly puts a lot of that down to ambulatory, and I'm not going to argue with her. So that's a little run through our ambulatory service and our sort of our slightly different approach to it. But just to sort of show that we actually are looking at this as a process and the ambulatory unit not in isolation, we've moved on to take the ambulatory process and start to roll it out further across the acute medicine shop floor. We, in January 2016, went live with what we call our 2-day unit, so our TDU, which was modelled along a very, very similar process to ambulatory: process activity mapping, demand mapping, and FMEA, and then a very, very process-driven approach with patient condition-specific pathways as well. The aim of that was to take Any patient that we felt could have a 2-day length of stay, keep them under the acute medicine team, and aim to discharge them with a very clear plan. We modelled using 72-hour length of stay patients, so expecting to be able to reduce the 3-day length of stays down to 2-day length of stays. And we've got a lovely, nice uplift on our graph there. You'll see, if those of you that are keen-eyed, the April 2015 was looking a lot better, our discharges from acute medicine. That's because at that point we were still including ambulatory in our numbers. So as of the end of, or mid-May, I think, or 2015, we removed ambulatory numbers from the overall discharges from our acute medicine service, so they were counted separately. And you can see it's been fairly static at about a 30% discharge rate from our acute take. The introduction of the 2-day unit in January has increased that by nearly 10% up to 41%. Our mean length of stay on the unit is sitting at around 24, 28 hours. So we are perfectly on target to continue with this process. So the whole process, the service redesign and the evidence-based service redesign, where else can we take it? Well, we are very much looking to scale up to and capture our entire inpatient acute medical cohort through a complete redesign of our acute medicine services. We're looking at moving our process change from a full front to back process to link the front door with the back door, because I'm sure everyone is fully aware that the front door only ever works if the back door is working well. And hence why we use 4-hour breaches in A&E as a barometer of hospital performance. And if we can link the whole process through and give patients a very structured, streamlined, lean process through the hospital, we can surely achieve some very, very impressive things. There are alternative areas we could look at implementing. Currently, we have no surgical admission service here, so it's something we would look at very, very much implementing with. A frail elderly strategy along a similar process line, again, is being talked about. Hem-oncology, we've talked to obstetrics and gynecology. We have a lot of ideas and a lot of ways that we think this whole process can be used. And I like putting this newspaper article up because it was nothing to do with us. It was a patient that I think wrote in and tipped off our local newspaper who came in and gave us a very nice positive report. So my final point would be that point at the bottom of this slide, which is that as much as we standardise a process, we can standardise a process without varying from the process too much. You'll get better outcomes. However, you need to standardise a process while enabling people to do their roles as best they can within that process, which I appreciate is not necessarily a simple concept, but it's something that I feel, and I think we as a team feel quite strongly about, that while the process itself with limited variation works fantastically well, part of that is because we've designed the process and engineered the process to enable the clinicians, the nurses, the healthcare assistants, the CSAs to do what they're good at and actually work within that process to the best of their abilities. So I'm going to stop there, and if there's any questions, please do.
Okay, thanks Dominic, that was great. Just to remind everybody that if anyone has got a question, you can either use the raise your hand option in the panel on the right hand side of the screen, or you could also, if you'd rather write your question in the question section on the panel, I can read it out to Dominic for you. So if we just give everyone a couple of minutes to do that. Okay, we've got a question, Dominic, from Michael Harper from Bart's Health. How many staff did you start the unit with? Is his question.
So we started the unit with, on a daily basis, a CSA, so a band 3, a nurse practitioner, a band 7, and either senior registrar, myself, or a consultant. So we have 3. We started off with 3 staff in the unit per day. We've now expanded about to usually 4, so either 2 nurses or 2 CSAs, and ideally 2 doctors, but that does depend a little bit on what happens.
Lovely, that's great. It looks like we've got another question from Andy Mitchell. I'll just unmute you, Andy. Hi, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, great. What's your question?
I was just wanted to, I mean, you did allude to this a little bit at the beginning of the talk, actually, and it's great to hear that you've seen point of care as an enabler rather than an end in itself.
Yes.
I know a lot of organisations sometimes see point of care as a bit of a panacea, and I just wondered how, when you looked at your overall process, whether you were able to identify some other rate limiting steps that also needed to be dealt with in tandem with introducing point of care.
Yes, very, very much so. I mean, I think I alluded to it. I mean, radiology and clinical imaging is always a rate limiting step. We've dealt with that as best as we can here. Ideally, I'd love to pay for another radiographer and a chest X-ray machine next to our unit, but they won't let me do that. So that was one. The other rate limiting step was actually our access to a senior clinical decision maker. If you look traditionally throughout most acute medicine floors, the acute medicine consultant will sort of wander around a couple of hours, maybe half a day later after the little juniors have been running around seeing these patients, and it's only then something happens. So we very deliberately put our senior clinical decision maker as close to the patient as they can get, so they get to see the patient within about 30 to 40 minutes every day for every patient. And then equally we've tried to, as part of our mapping process, we've looked at staff numbers and staff ratios, and when our patients arrive, and we did predict we would get, I think, 0.9 patients per hour throughout a 12-hour day. And we do roughly get that. It varies a little bit. But so therefore we are staffed to accommodate that, so our CSA can get to a patient within 15 minutes every time, to sort of reduce that rate limiting step as well. Does that answer the question enough, or do you want to leave it at other points?
No, that's absolutely perfect. What I was trying to bring out in the discussion, which you've done, is people often see technological answers as the solution rather than behaviour change answers. And what you said there clearly demonstrates that technology can do so much, but behaviour is really, really important.
Yeah, exactly. I am very much a technological geek, I suppose. I can look for technological answers. And we have used other forms of technology. The one that I actually haven't used an example today, which I often do, is our documentation. So we redesigned our documentation booklet to slim it down for our ambulatory patients, and then we realised that we were having to then electronically type out a discharge letter to send to the GP as well. So nowadays, if there's nothing complicated with the patient, if there are one-off attenders, we just type it onto the discharge letter. We don't write it out again.
Excellent.
Okay. Is that lovely? It doesn't look like we've got any more questions at the moment, Dominic. If anybody does think of any questions, you can always email them to the ESIP info box, which is, the address is esipinfo@nhselect.org.uk, and then we can always redirect your question to Dominic to reply to you. Is there anything you'd like to add, Dominic, before we bring the session to a close?
No, I don't think so. If we've sparked anything, any sort of flashes of inspiration to anybody, if anyone would like more information or to see the unit, then please do email, and we're more than happy to have visitors and show them around. Okay,
that's great. So I think as we've got no more questions, that brings us to the end of this session. Just also a quick reminder that the recording of this webinar will be available on the ESIP website shortly. Just to say goodbye and thank you for joining us online for this webinar. Thank you, Dominic.
Thank you.